What would you do if your husband handed you divorce papers at brunch, without a word, after one night of laughter you swore meant nothing? That's what happened to me. One stupid moment of showing off turned into the end of everything I thought I controlled. I'm Isolde Merrin, 34, and until that dinner party, I honestly believed I had everything under control. A good job in marketing, a beautiful home, a smart husband who adored me, and friends who thought I was effortlessly confident. Graham, my husband, 36, was the quiet kind, dependable, calm, the type who fixed things before I even noticed they were broken. But lately, his calmness had started to irritate me. I told myself I needed someone who matched my energy, who saw how magnetic I could be when I wasn't stuck in routine. That's how Elias came into the picture. A colleague with a quick smile and sharper words, someone who made me feel seen again. At first it was harmless. Late meetings, jokes in the break room, little compliments that made long afternoons feel less heavy. I convinced myself it was fine because nothing serious was happening. I was married, not dead. Graham never questioned my schedule, never demanded explanations, and I mistook his trust for weakness. When he asked if I wanted to skip the company mixer that Friday, I told him he was being boring. He only smiled, said he'd be waiting when I got home. That patience, it made me want to shake him. At the office, Elias leaned close while we set up the presentation, his voice low, teasing about how a woman like me must drive her husband crazy. I laughed too loudly. People turned to look, and I didn't care. It felt good to be the center again. That night, when Graham asked how it went, I told him Elias carried the whole thing. He said he was proud of me anyway, that I always made things work. I remember rolling my eyes. Somewhere in that moment, something small but important cracked between us. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, just reclaiming a bit of excitement. But even then, part of me knew I was balancing on a line I couldn't see clearly anymore. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The house always felt too quiet after Graham left for work. That morning, I stood by the kitchen window, stirring coffee I didn't even want, staring out at the same row of perfect hedges we'd planted our first spring here. Everything about our life was tidy, predictable, safe, and lately, that word felt like a cage. Graham thrived on predictability. He liked his routines, his spreadsheets, his calm tone that never cracked, even when I was throwing sarcasm like darts. People always said we balanced each other, his steadiness, my spark. But lately, I wondered if maybe he'd just learned to tolerate me instead of actually seeing me. At work, things were different. I was Isolde Merrin, account manager at one of the top marketing firms downtown. People noticed when I walked in. Not because I was stunning or anything dramatic, but because I filled the room. I talked fast, thought faster, and had a way of making people laugh even when they didn't want to. That was where Elias came in. He joined the company 6 months ago, sharp suit, sharper tongue, and this habit of making every conversation sound like a secret. He'd ask harmless things, how long I'd been married, what Graham did, and listen with that half smile that said he already knew what I wasn't admitting. The first time I mentioned Graham to him, I said he was an engineer, quiet, methodical, maybe too methodical. Elias laughed softly and said, "So he's the opposite of you." It was a simple comment, but it stayed with me. The opposite of me. Maybe that's why I started lingering a little longer at Elias's desk after meetings, or why I didn't mind when our team lunches turned into late drinks. He made me feel like the exciting version of myself I used to be. Before marriage, before bills, before life became a checklist. At home, Graham didn't seem to notice the difference. He'd kiss me on the cheek while stirring pasta, ask about my day in that steady, unbothered voice. I'd talk about deadlines or office drama, deliberately leaving Elias out. though his name sat right on my tongue. When Graham suggested taking a weekend trip, I told him I was too busy with work. That wasn't a lie, but the work I was thinking about wasn't in my inbox. One Friday night, after a client dinner, Elias offered to walk me to my car. It was raining lightly, the street lamps glowing gold on wet pavement. He asked if Graham ever got jealous of my hours, of the attention I got at work. I laughed and said, "Graham doesn't really get jealous. He's too reasonable for that." Elias grinned, said he'd find that hard to believe if I were his wife. It was just talk, but something in me flickered. That night, when I came home to find Graham asleep on the couch, still wearing his glasses, I felt both guilty and annoyed. Guilty for feeling wanted by someone else, annoyed that my husband didn't notice I'd stayed out late. The next morning, I made a show of cleaning the kitchen just to make noise. Graham came in, rubbing his eyes, asking if I'd slept well. I said I'd been working late, which wasn't technically a lie. He smiled that same patient smile and offered to make pancakes. It made me want to scream. How could he be so calm, so sure? I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't sleeping with Elias. I wasn't even flirting. Not really. I just liked feeling seen, and Graham should have been the one seeing me. A few days later, something small but strange happened. I'd left one of my lipsticks at the office, a coral shade I never wore at home, because Graham said he preferred the natural look. When I found it in my work bag, there was a faint smudge on my coffee mug at home, the colour too bright to be mine from that morning. Graham had done the dishes. I noticed him glance at the cup as he set it on the counter. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered for a second too long. Then he smiled again, quiet as ever, and said he'd pick up groceries after work. That night, over dinner, he mentioned a team barbecue his company was hosting next weekend. I said I'd think about it. He asked if Elias would be at my client retreat the same weekend, his tone casual, not sharp. My heart skipped. I lied easily, said Elias wasn't going. Graham nodded slowly, said, "That's good," and went back to eating. I wanted him to ask more, to press, to fight for clarity. But he didn't. He just let silence fill the space until I almost wished he'd accuse me of something. When I told Teresa about it later, she laughed. "You've got him trained too well," she said. "He's scared to rock the boat." I laughed too, pretending that was what I wanted. But deep down, I started to realize the balance had shifted. Graham wasn't scared. He was watching. And for the first time, I couldn't tell if I was still the one in control. It started feeling like a game after that, one I didn't admit I was playing. I told myself I was just having fun, letting loose after years of being the reliable wife. At the office, Elias and I found new excuses to spend time together. Late client calls, brainstorming sessions, working lunches that lingered well past the hour. I started dressing differently too. Blazers with a little more shape, perfume I used to save for special occasions. When co-workers noticed, I pretended not to hear the jokes about the office power couple. Elias would smirk and say, I made him look good. I laughed like it was nothing. At home, I was careful. Graham wasn't stupid, just quiet. He noticed things. How I started locking my phone, how my tone softened when I texted, how I wore lipstick on a Wednesday night for client meetings. Once, he asked gently if I was happy, just like that. No accusation, no edge. I said I was fine and changed the subject to Callum's school project. He didn't push, just nodded, like he was filing something away. Teresa said I was overthinking. She'd met Elias at a networking event and thought he was harmlessly charming. You're allowed to have work friends, she said. If Graham can't handle that, that's his insecurity, not your fault. I repeated that line to myself like a prayer every time I felt a twinge of guilt. It wasn't cheating if it stayed under control. It was attention. Harmless, fleeting attention. But Elias had this way of testing boundaries. Tiny things at first. A lingering touch when handing me papers. a whispered joke during meetings, a message late at night that said, "You looked incredible today." "Don't tell your husband I said that. I should have ignored it." Instead, I texted back, "He wouldn't notice if you did." That one message was the first real line crossed, though it didn't feel that way then. At the next company happy hour, things escalated. We sat close, laughing at stories I barely listened to. I knew people were watching, and for some reason, I liked it. When Elias called me trouble under his breath, I felt a rush of power. I forgot for a second that I was married. When I came home that night, Graham was still awake on the couch, the TV on mute. He asked how the night went, eyes fixed on the blank screen. I said it was fine, same old stuff. He nodded. "You smell different," he said quietly. My stomach dropped, but I smiled. "It's new shampoo," I lied. He didn't argue. He just turned off the TV and went upstairs. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, a note on the counter saying he'd be working late. I spent the day restless, scrolling through texts, waiting for Elias to message first. When he finally did, it was something casual. Lunch later. But I stared at it longer than I should have. That afternoon, as we walked to the cafe, Elias joked about how serious Graham always looked in the few photos I'd shown him. "He's probably the kind of guy who folds his socks by color," he said, and I laughed too hard, louder than I meant to. By the time we got back to the office, the rest of the team had noticed our closeness. A few whispered comments followed us down the hall. I brushed it off. Let them talk. But later that night, as I scrolled through social media, I saw a short video one of the interns had posted from happy hour. Just a few seconds of me and Elias, laughing too closely, his hand brushing my arm. It had already been liked by half the office. My stomach flipped. I deleted my tag immediately, but it was too late. Graham followed that intern's account. When I got home, he was quiet again. He'd cooked dinner, his usual way of keeping the peace. Halfway through the meal, he asked how things at work were. His tone was so casual, I almost didn't catch the edge in it. I said busy, nothing new. He nodded and asked if Elias was settling in well. I froze for a second before answering, "Yeah, he's fine." Graham smiled faintly. "Seems like a funny guy," he said. I laughed it off, changed the subject, pretended not to notice how he kept his eyes on his plate. That night, when I showered, I caught my reflection in the fogged mirror. Hair done, lipstick faintly staining my lips from the day before. I should have felt guilty. Instead, I told myself Graham had no one to blame but himself for making me feel invisible. The next day at work, Elias leaned against my desk and said he'd gotten a message from HR reminding everyone about appropriate workplace behavior. He winked and said someone must have complained about our chemistry. I laughed again, but it sounded hollow. When I came home that night, Graham had already gone to bed, the guest room door slightly open. I stood there staring at the empty space beside my side of the bed and felt something shift in the air, like the quiet had teeth now, and it was waiting for me to make the next mistake. The dinner party was supposed to be harmless fun, just colleagues, spouses, and a few close friends at that new downtown bistro everyone had been raving about. I picked the restaurant myself. Sleek lighting, soft music, perfect for photos. Graham wasn't thrilled about going. He never liked mixing with my work crowd. But I insisted. I said it would be good for him to meet the people I spent half my life with. What I really meant was that I wanted Elias to see me with my husband, to feel that strange, thrilling pull between what I had and what I thought I could have. When we arrived, Elias was already there, sitting at the bar with a drink in his hand. He stood when he saw me, complimented my dress in that quiet tone that always felt too personal. Graham shook his hand, polite but distant, and I could tell immediately he didn't like him. I brushed it off. Graham didn't like most people who talked too much. We joined the group at the long table, and for a while it was easy. Wine flowing, jokes, stories from work. Graham stayed mostly silent, smiling in that tight way he does when he's trying to fit in. Elias, on the other hand, was his usual magnetic self, making everyone laugh. About halfway through dinner, the conversation turned to relationships. Someone made a joke about how marriage changes everything, and Elias smirked. He said, "Come on, Isolde, tell them. Is your husband one of the lucky ones or the disciplined ones?" The table laughed. I should have stopped him right there. Instead, I rolled my eyes dramatically and said something like, "Oh, Graham's the organized type. You know, every sock folded, every thought scheduled." That got another laugh, and the wine made it easy to keep going. Elias leaned in, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone. "Bet he even times it in bed, huh?" he said, smirking at me. The table went silent for a beat, then a few people chuckled, awkwardly. I laughed too loud, too quick, just to fill the air. "Please," I said, "he's an engineer. Precision is kind of his thing." The laughter came then, nervous but real. I could feel Graham go still beside me, but I didn't look at him. I just kept smiling, pretending it was all fine. Elias didn't stop. He said, "Man, I wish I could compete with that kind of focus," and raised his glass toward Graham in mock salute. I laughed again. What else was I supposed to do? Pretend to be offended? That would make it worse. I kept the smile glued to my face, ignoring the way Graham's hand tightened around his fork. Someone at the end of the table changed the subject, but the mood had already shifted. After dessert, Graham excused himself quietly, said he had an early morning. I told him to relax, to stay a little longer, but he only looked at me for a moment, calm, unreadable, and said he'd take a cab home. I didn't go after him. I stayed and kept drinking, pretending his leaving wasn't a big deal. Elias leaned close and whispered that Graham seemed fragile. I laughed again, even though my chest felt tight. When I got home later that night, the house was dark. Graham's shoes were by the door, but he wasn't in our bedroom. I found him in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed. He didn't look angry, just tired in a way I hadn't seen before. I started to explain, saying it was just jokes, just wine, that everyone laughed. He said quietly, "I know, that's the part that hurts." Then he stood up, slipped off his wedding ring, and set it on the nightstand. I followed him into the hallway, saying he was overreacting, that I'd only laughed because not laughing would have made it awkward. He didn't turn around. He just said, "You made me a punchline," and walked past me. His tone wasn't sharp, but it cut deeper than shouting ever could. I waited up, thinking he'd come back to our room, that he'd cool down like he always did. But he didn't. In the morning, the guest room door was open, the bed empty. He'd gone to work early. No note, no message. I told myself he just needed space. Still, something in the air felt final, like a thread had snapped quietly in the night. When I went into the kitchen, his ring was still on the counter beside his coffee mug, perfectly centered, as if he wanted to make sure I'd see it. I texted Teresa later that day, telling her Graham was being ridiculous, that it was just a stupid joke everyone understood. She didn't reply right away. When she finally did, she only said, "You laughed, Izzy. That's all anyone will remember." I didn't want to believe her. I convinced myself Graham would get over it. He always did. But that night, when I checked my phone, I saw he'd unfollowed me on social media, something he'd never done in all our years together. It was such a small thing, but it made my stomach twist. I went to bed alone again, the silence in the house so heavy it felt like a warning. The days after the dinner felt like walking through fog. Graham wasn't shouting or slamming doors. He just stopped speaking, unless it was absolutely necessary. His silence scared me more than anger ever could. He still made breakfast for Callum, still packed his bag for work, still took out the trash, but he moved through the house like I wasn't there. I'd try to start small talk, something about the weather or bills, and he'd answer in one-word replies. "Fine." "Handled." "Okay." It was like living with a polite stranger. I told myself I'd give him time. He was embarrassed, that was all. He'd realize I hadn't meant anything cruel. that it was just a dumb joke taken too far. But when a week passed and he still hadn't so much as looked at me properly, I started to panic. I texted Teresa to come over. She listened while I paced the kitchen, explaining that Graham was being childish. "You humiliated him in front of everyone, Izzy," she said. "What did you expect?" I snapped back that men needed thicker skin, that he should have defended himself instead of sulking. She just stared at me, like she was realizing something about me she hadn't seen before. When she left, she hugged me in that quiet, uneasy way that feels like goodbye. At work, things weren't much better. The clip from that dinner had made the rounds. Someone had posted a photo of me laughing, Elias raising his glass in mock salute. The caption read, "Friday nights with the fearless duo." People didn't say anything to my face, but I felt the shift. The glances, the smirks, the way conversation stopped when I walked by. I tried to focus on my work, pretending it didn't matter. But every time I opened my phone, that frozen moment, me laughing, Graham sitting stiff beside me, stared back. One night, when I got home late, I found an envelope on the counter. Inside was a bank notice. Graham had moved our joint savings into a separate account. I confronted him the next morning, voice sharp, saying he couldn't just take money without talking to me. He said calmly that he wasn't taking anything, just protecting what was his. "From who?" I asked. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "From you." Then he grabbed his keys and left. That was the first time I realized he wasn't just hurt. He was planning something. I tried to fix it my way, through optics. I called my parents, telling them Graham was going through a phase, that he was having some kind of midlife crisis. I needed them to take my side before he could tell his version. My mother, always eager to play therapist, said maybe he felt emasculated. I laughed and said he'd been born that way. She didn't laugh back. Even Callum noticed. One evening, he asked why Daddy slept in the other room. I said Daddy was tired, that he needed space. He nodded like he understood, but when he hugged me goodnight, he asked if Daddy was mad because of the laughing thing. My stomach turned. Graham must have said something, or maybe he didn't have to. Kids see everything. When I tried calling Graham at work, he stopped picking up. When I texted, he replied hours later with dry messages. "Callum's pickup is at 4. Leftovers in the fridge. Please don't contact me at the office." No emotion, no warmth. Just distance. I wanted to hate him for being so cold, but deep down, I knew I'd built that wall myself. A few days later, Martha, his mother, called. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she said she'd heard enough stories about what happened. I tried to sound composed, said people were exaggerating. She cut me off. "My son doesn't exaggerate humiliation, he's older." Her voice was calm but lethal. "You made him small to entertain strangers, and he won't forget that." Then she hung up. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and stared at the silent phone. I told myself Martha was manipulating him, that he'd come around eventually. But the next morning, another envelope appeared on the counter, this time with the logo of a law firm. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a petition for divorce. The words felt unreal, irreconcilable differences arising from public humiliation and marital misconduct. He'd already signed. The date at the bottom was the day after the dinner. He hadn't needed time to think. He'd made his decision immediately. I drove to his mother's house that afternoon, furious and shaking. When I knocked, Graham opened the door but didn't invite me in. He looked calm, rested, almost peaceful. I said he couldn't just destroy our family over one mistake. He said he wasn't destroying anything, just setting himself free from someone who enjoyed watching him be mocked. "Is this about pride?" I asked. "Because pride won't keep you warm at night." He said, "Neither will contempt." Then he closed the door. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wood grain of the door like it might change its mind. When I finally left, my reflection in the car window looked unfamiliar. Someone proud, furious, and completely alone. The meeting at the mediation office was colder than any courtroom could ever be. I'd spent the night before rehearsing what I would say, how I'd sound calm, reasonable, even wounded. The plan was to make Graham remember the version of me he used to protect. I wore my softest blouse, the one he'd once said made me look kind. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting beside his lawyer, papers neatly stacked, no ring on his finger. He looked like a stranger who just happened to know every detail of my life. The mediator started by explaining the process, her voice steady, professional. I barely heard her. I kept waiting for Graham to look at me. When he finally did, it was quick, polite, like he was glancing at an old photo. His lawyer handed over a folder. Asset summaries, bank statements, copies of messages I didn't remember saving. My throat went dry. I opened it and there they were, screenshots of texts between me and Elias, cropped perfectly, time-stamped. Nothing obscene, but intimate enough to twist the knife. Lines like, "You get me better than anyone, and he wouldn't notice if I vanished." I looked up, furious. "You went through my phone?" He shook his head. "No, you left your laptop synced. I just stopped pretending not to see." The lawyer cleared her throat, moving us back to legalities, but I could feel my face burning. I said those messages were taken out of context, that it wasn't an affair, just bad judgment. Graham didn't argue. He didn't even roll his eyes. He just said, "Context doesn't change intention." When it came time to discuss finances, I tried to sound reasonable, said we could still keep things civil, that there was no need to make it ugly. He said, "I'm not making it ugly, I'm making it official." The mediator asked about custody arrangements for Callum. That was the first time Graham's composure wavered. His voice cracked slightly when he said he wanted to keep the house for stability. I tried to interrupt, saying Callum needed his mother more. He looked straight at me then. "He needs peace more," he said quietly. The mediator noted something down, and I hated her for it. After the session, while the lawyers discussed scheduling, I tried to speak to him alone. He didn't move. I said we could still fix this if he'd just talked to me like before. He said, "Before, I believed you were on my side." I said I was, that I'd made one mistake, that everyone laughs at stupid jokes sometimes. He said, "You didn't laugh at a joke, you laughed at me." The calmness in his tone broke me more than shouting would have. I reached for his arm, but he stepped back. "You've always thought silence meant weakness," he said. "It's not. It's control." Then he picked up his folder and walked out. I sat there long after he'd gone, pretending to check my phone so the mediator wouldn't see me cry. Elias had texted earlier that morning. "Things still messy?" And seeing his name made me sick. I didn't even reply. He'd stopped mentioning the dinner weeks ago, acting like it was ancient history, like he hadn't been the one who started the joke. 2 days later, I got another call from Graham's lawyer. They'd filed an amendment, a request for temporary custody until the court reviewed emotional stability factors. I called him immediately, furious, saying he couldn't use our son as leverage. He said, "I'm not. I'm protecting him from the fallout." I told him he was heartless, that he was weaponizing paperwork. He said, "You weaponized laughter." Then he hung up. Teresa came over that evening with takeout and pity in her eyes. She told me quietly that Graham had been meeting with a financial advisor months before the dinner, preparing for separation long before I even realized anything was wrong. "He didn't just react," she said. "He planned." That word made me feel small, planned, like he'd seen me coming. A week later, we met again for mediation, and this time Martha was there. She sat beside Graham, hands folded, calm as a statue. She didn't speak once, but her presence said everything, that he wasn't alone anymore. I tried one last time to appeal to him. I said maybe we could try counseling, start over for Callum's sake. He didn't even look at me when he answered. "Callum deserves honesty, not performance." When we left, I followed him into the hallway, asking if this was really what he wanted. He turned, met my eyes for the first time in weeks, and said, "I wanted you to care before you lost everything." Then he walked away again, steady as ever. That night, I opened the folder he'd left behind by accident. Inside was a printed email from his lawyer confirming the court date. And below it, a personal note written in Graham's neat handwriting. "Dignity is quiet, but it never forgets." I stared at the words until they blurred, realizing that for the first time, I wasn't the one holding power. The morning of the hearing felt unreal, like I was walking through someone else's story. I sat in the car outside the courthouse, makeup perfect, hands shaking. I kept telling myself this was temporary, that Graham would come to his senses once he saw me, once he remembered who we were. But when he stepped out of his own car across the lot, he didn't even glance my way. He was dressed in a navy suit, calm and composed, as if this was just another meeting. Martha was with him, holding Callum's hand. I waved automatically, but Callum looked down. Inside, everything moved too fast. The lawyers spoke in their measured tones, passing papers back and forth while the judge asked routine questions. Graham answered clearly, politely, never looking at me for more than a second. When it was my turn to speak, I said I'd been under stress, that the dinner incident was a misunderstanding. My voice trembled more than I wanted it to. The judge nodded, unimpressed. The words public humiliation and loss of trust echoed through the room like a verdict long before one was given. At one point, Graham's lawyer handed the judge a folder of printed screenshots. The same messages, the same social media photos, everything preserved and labeled. There was even a copy of that video from the dinner, the one where I laughed too loudly while Elias raised his glass. Watching it on a courtroom screen was unbearable. My own laughter sounded foreign, shrill, hollow, cruel. I looked down, pretending to adjust my papers, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. When the judge announced temporary custody would go to Graham pending review, something inside me cracked. I wanted to argue, to fight, but the words wouldn't come. My lawyer whispered that it wasn't final, that we could appeal, but it didn't matter. I could see in Graham's eyes that he'd already moved on emotionally, that this was just paperwork catching up. Afterward, outside in the parking lot, I tried to speak to him again. He stood by his car, buckling Callum's seatbelt. I said I didn't understand how he could just erase everything. 17 years together, a home, a family. He said, "You erased it the moment you decided my pain was funny." I said he was being cruel. He said, "No, I'm just done performing forgiveness." Then he closed the car door and turned away. Martha lingered a moment, looking at me with something almost like pity. She said quietly, "You thought control was love. It wasn't. Now you get to find out what love looks like when it stops serving you." Then she joined them, leaving me standing there in the wind. I drove home slowly, passing all the familiar landmarks. The park where we'd taken Callum for his first bike ride. The cafe where Graham used to meet me for lunch before everything got complicated. Each place felt like a scene from a life I'd already been written out of. The house was silent when I got back. His things were gone. The shelves looked too neat, too empty. Only my reflection in the dark kitchen window stared back, polished, tired, and utterly alone. Teresa texted later asking how it went. I typed, "He got everything he wanted," then deleted it. What was the point? She'd warned me this could happen. Everyone had, in their own way. Even Graham, with his quiet patience, had been warning me for years. I just never listened because I thought silence meant safety. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the dining table, the same one where we'd eaten hundreds of meals together, the same one where I'd once mocked him for being too serious, for never joining in the laughter. Now the silence around that table felt like punishment, and I realized he'd left it behind on purpose. I looked at the divorce decree lying open on the table, the stamp reading finalized. For a long time, I just stared at it. The papers didn't feel real. Not the signatures, not the date, not even my own name in print. It was like proof of something I'd been pretending couldn't happen. I kept expecting the front door to open, for him to walk in and tell me we could fix it, that it had gone far enough. But the door stayed closed. When the sun went down, the house grew darker than I remembered it ever being. The silence pressed in on me until I could hear my own heartbeat. I thought of that dinner table, of the laughter I'd chosen over kindness, of how sure I'd been that I could handle the fallout. I thought of Graham's last words in the hallway weeks ago. Dignity is quiet, but it never forgets. He was right, it never does. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.